When emotional over-investment happens too early, the balance in a dating dynamic begins to shift in subtle but powerful ways. It rarely looks dramatic at first. It often starts with good intentions, wanting to show interest, commitment, care, and sincerity. But when a man places a woman at the emotional center of his life before she has earned that position, he unintentionally hands over psychological leverage. Overinvestment means more than liking someone. It means prioritizing her emotions over your own stability, rearranging your time, goals, and sense of self to accommodate her, and allowing her reactions to determine your mood and confidence. When this happens early, before mutual investment has formed, attraction quietly begins to weaken. Not because care is unattractive, but because imbalance is. Psychological dominance does not require manipulation or cruelty. It often emerges naturally when one person needs the relationship more than the other. The person who is less emotionally dependent always holds more power, whether they intend to or not. When a man overinvests, he communicates without words that his emotional well-being is tied to her responses. This creates an unspoken hierarchy where she leads emotionally and he follows. Many men believe that giving more will secure affection. In reality, giving too much too soon removes mystery, tension, and polarity. Attraction grows when both people feel free, grounded, and self-directed. When a man becomes emotionally centered around a woman, his world begins to orbit her choices, moods, and availability. She may feel admired at first, but over time, the weight of that attention creates pressure rather than desire. This dynamic also affects behavior. Over-invested men tend to explain themselves excessively, apologize unnecessarily, and seek reassurance instead of certainty. They become hyper-aware of changes in tone, delayed replies, or emotional distance. Each small signal feels significant because their emotional center is no longer anchored within themselves. This reactivity makes them easier to influence, not because the woman is intentionally dominating, but because he has surrendered internal authority. From a psychological perspective, attraction thrives on self-sufficiency. A man who is grounded in his purpose, routine, and values brings emotional stability into the relationship. A man who abandons those foundations to secure connection loses the very qualities that created attraction in the first place. Emotional overinvestment collapses polarity. It turns curiosity into predictability and desire into obligation. It's important to understand that this is not about withholding care or playing games. It is about pacing investment according to reality, not fantasy. Mutual investment grows naturally when both people maintain their own center. When a man leads his life with structure and direction, a woman experiences him as emotionally strong. When he abandons that structure to please, impress, or secure her, dominance shifts quietly. Over time, this imbalance often leads to resentment on both sides. The man feels unappreciated, anxious, or taken for granted. The woman feels pressure, loss of attraction, or confusion about why things changed. Neither person planned this outcome. It emerged from a subtle psychological shift that began the moment emotional investment outpaced emotional grounding. The solution is not emotional withdrawal, but emotional discipline. A man must remain the center of his own life while allowing connection to grow organically. When his confidence, happiness, and identity are not dependent on her validation, the dynamic equalizes. Respect returns, attraction stabilizes, and influence balances naturally. When a man anchors his emotions within himself instead of outsourcing them to a relationship, psychological dominance dissolves and mutual desire has space to breathe. Validation seeking is one of the quietest ways psychological leverage shifts in dating and relationships. It doesn't announce itself loudly, and it often hides behind good intentions. Wanting to be liked, wanting reassurance, wanting to feel chosen, these are human desires. The problem begins when a man's emotional stability becomes dependent on receiving that validation from a woman. The moment approval becomes a requirement rather than a bonus, leverage is created. When a man looks to a woman to confirm his worth, attractiveness, or value, he unconsciously places her in a position of authority over his emotional state. Her reactions begin to matter more than his own standards. A smile lifts him, silence unsettles him, and disapproval shakes him. This dynamic does not require her to do anything manipulative. Power shifts naturally toward the person whose approval is being sought. Validation seeking often shows up in subtle behaviors, over-explaining choices, constantly checking if something is okay, fishing for reassurance, or changing opinions to match hers. On the surface, this may look like consideration or flexibility. Psychologically, however, it communicates uncertainty and dependency. It signals that a man is unsure of himself and needs external confirmation to feel secure. Attraction struggles to survive in that environment because desire is rooted in confidence and self-trust. Women are highly perceptive to emotional cues, even when nothing is said directly. When a man seeks validation, it registers as emotional instability rather than emotional openness. It places pressure on her because now she is not just a partner, she is the regulator of his confidence. Over time, this pressure creates imbalance. She may feel admired, but admiration without self-groundedness often turns into discomfort or disinterest. This is where psychological dominance quietly forms. The person who controls validation controls emotional direction. If a man's mood rises and falls based on her responses, she holds influence by default. She doesn't need to demand it. His behavior adapts automatically, trying harder, giving more, compromising boundaries to regain approval whenever it feels threatened. This reactive pattern erodes respect and shifts the dynamic further. Validation seeking also weakens boundaries. A man who fears disapproval is less likely to say no, express disagreement, or stand firm in his values. He may tolerate behavior that doesn't align with his standards just to avoid tension or loss. Each time this happens, he reinforces the imbalance. Psychological dominance grows not because she takes control, but because he gives it away piece by piece. The opposite of validation seeking is not emotional coldness. It is internal validation. A man who knows who he is, what he values, and where he is going does not require constant reassurance. He appreciates appreciation, but he is not destabilized by its absence. This internal grounding makes him emotionally self-sufficient. When he speaks, acts, or sets boundaries, he does so from certainty rather than fear of reaction. When a man validates himself, the dynamic shifts immediately. His energy becomes calm instead of anxious. His presence becomes steady instead of reactive. He no longer adjusts his behavior to manage outcomes. He allows outcomes to respond to him. This restores balance and removes psychological leverage from the relationship entirely. Attraction becomes a byproduct, not a pursuit. It's important to understand that validation seeking is often learned. Many men were conditioned to believe their value is measured by approval, romantic, social, or professional. Unlearning this pattern requires discipline and awareness. It requires choosing self-respect over reassurance and alignment over approval. That choice is felt immediately in how a man carries himself. When validation comes from within, influence equalizes, respect stabilizes, and relationships shift from power struggles to genuine connection. And that is where real strength begins to show. A lack of boundaries is one of the most common reasons psychological control quietly forms in dating and relationships. It doesn't begin with domination or intent. It begins with avoidance, avoiding discomfort, conflict, or the risk of displeasing someone. When a man consistently chooses peace over clarity, he teaches the other person where the lines are missing. And where lines are missing, influence naturally expands. Boundaries are not rules meant to restrict connection. They are structures that protect respect. They define what you accept, what you decline, and how you expect to be treated. When boundaries are unclear or inconsistently enforced, the dynamic becomes unbalanced. The person with firmer limits holds more stability, and stability creates leverage. This is not about power games. It is about emotional physics. Many men confuse boundaries with rigidity or fear that saying no will make them appear uncaring. So they tolerate behavior they are uncomfortable with, delay difficult conversations, and adjust their standards to keep things smooth. At first, this feels generous. Over time, it becomes costly. Each time a boundary is softened or ignored, self-respect quietly erodes. And when self-respect erodes, respect from others often follows. Subtle control grows in this space. When a man avoids setting limits, his reactions become predictable. He will accommodate, explain, or retreat rather than confront. This predictability makes it easier for the other person to steer outcomes, not necessarily out of malice, but because the dynamic allows it. Decisions start being made based on avoiding his discomfort rather than honoring his values. Lack of boundaries also creates confusion. When expectations are unclear, resentment builds silently. The man may feel overlooked or taken for granted, while the woman may feel increasingly dissatisfied without knowing why. Attraction struggles in this environment because desire depends on clarity and polarity. Boundaries create that clarity. Without them, the relationship drifts into emotional imbalance. Another consequence is emotional suppression. Men who lack boundaries often silence their needs to maintain harmony. They tell themselves it's not worth bringing up, that they should be understanding, that things will improve. But unspoken needs do not disappear, they accumulate. Over time, suppressed frustration turns into passive behavior, emotional distance, or sudden outbursts. None of these restore balance, they deepen instability. Healthy boundaries communicate self-worth without aggression. Saying no calmly, expressing discomfort clearly, and standing by personal standards signal confidence. This does not push people away, it filters dynamics into healthier forms. A man who respects himself teaches others how to treat him. When boundaries are present, influence equalizes because both people know where they stand. Importantly, boundaries must be consistent. Setting a limit once and abandoning it later teaches the other person that resistance will fade. Consistency reinforces credibility. It shows that your standards are not negotiable based on mood or fear of loss. This steadiness creates emotional safety, which paradoxically increases attraction rather than diminishing it. Boundaries are also how a man maintains his identity within a relationship. Without them, he merges his needs with his partner's and loses his center. With them, he remains grounded while still connected. This balance prevents psychological dominance from forming because neither person becomes dependent or over-accommodating. Ultimately, boundaries are not about control, they are about self-respect. When a man is willing to experience temporary discomfort to preserve long-term integrity, the dynamic shifts, influence balances, respect returns, and connection becomes healthier and more stable. And from that place, relationships stop feeling like quiet power struggles and start feeling like mutual choice. Fear of loss is one of the most powerful forces shaping behavior in dating and relationships. And when it becomes stronger than self-respect, psychological balance begins to collapse. This fear rarely announces itself clearly. It disguises itself as compromise, patience, loyalty, or understanding. But beneath it lies a subtle shift. Decisions are no longer made from values, but from anxiety about losing the connection. When a man begins to fear losing a woman more than losing himself, his behavior changes. He hesitates to speak honestly. He tolerates disrespect he would never accept from anyone else. He lowers standards he once held firmly. Each small concession feels harmless in the moment, but together they form a pattern where self-respect is slowly traded for reassurance. And once that trade begins, influence quietly moves away from him. Fear of loss creates reactive behavior. Instead of acting from direction, a man starts responding to moods, threats of withdrawal, or emotional distance. If she pulls away, he pursues harder. If she becomes cold, he becomes more accommodating. His actions are no longer rooted in choice, but in fear management. This reactivity is felt immediately. It signals that his emotional center has shifted outside of himself and into the relationship. Psychologically, the person who fears loss the most is always at a disadvantage. They become easier to influence not because they are weak, but because fear narrows perception. It prioritizes short-term relief over long-term respect. A man who fears loss may convince himself that staying quiet is strength, that endurance proves love, or that sacrificing boundaries is maturity. In reality, these choices often weaken attraction and erode trust on both sides. This dynamic also distorts authenticity. When fear governs behavior, honesty becomes selective. A man may hide discomfort, soften opinions, or suppress needs to avoid conflict. Over time, the relationship stops being a place of truth and becomes a place of performance. The woman may sense this shift even if she cannot articulate it. Attraction diminishes when authenticity fades because desire responds to grounded presence, not quiet self-abandonment. Fear of loss also creates imbalance in responsibility. The man becomes overly responsible for maintaining the relationship, fixing problems, and preventing rupture. He carries emotional weight that should be shared. This burden does not increase intimacy, it creates exhaustion and resentment. Meanwhile, the other person unconsciously feels less invested because investment flows toward where strength and stability reside. Self-respect is not stubbornness or emotional withdrawal. It is the willingness to stand by one's values even when there is risk. A man with self-respect understands that losing himself is a greater cost than losing a relationship. He knows that attraction built on fear is unstable, and that respect cannot grow where integrity is compromised. This understanding changes how he moves, speaks, and decides. When self-respect leads, fear loses its grip. A man can express needs without pleading, set boundaries without anger, and walk away from dynamics that diminish him. This does not guarantee outcomes, but it restores balance, and paradoxically, this restoration often increases attraction because strength and clarity replace anxiety and accommodation. Fear of loss thrives in scarcity thinking, the belief that this connection is the only one, that walking away means failure, that starting over is worse than staying diminished. Self-respect thrives in abundance thinking, the understanding that alignment matters more than attachment, and that a relationship should enhance life, not consume identity. When a man chooses self-respect over fear, psychological dominance dissolves. The dynamic becomes cleaner, calmer, and more honest. Even if the relationship continues, it does so from mutual choice rather than emotional leverage. And that choice is where real power quietly returns. When a man operates primarily from reaction rather than direction, psychological balance in a relationship begins to tilt. Reactive behavior feels natural in the moment because it is driven by emotion, responding to tone, moods, approval, withdrawal, or tension. But over time, reactivity weakens presence and hands over influence to external circumstances. Purpose-driven action, by contrast, anchors a man internally and restores balance without force. Reactive behavior means your actions are shaped by what just happened. If she pulls away, you chase. If she becomes distant, you become anxious. If she's happy, you feel secure. If she's upset, you feel unstable. Your emotional state becomes a reflection of hers. This pattern subtly communicates that your inner world is not self-governed, and the person who is not self-governed becomes easier to influence. This does not mean emotions are wrong. Emotions are signals. The problem arises when emotions dictate behavior without reflection. Reactivity bypasses choice. It replaces intention with impulse. In dating and relationships, this shows up as over-texting after silence, changing plans to avoid disappointment, or saying things you don't fully mean just to stabilize the moment. These actions may bring temporary relief, but they weaken long-term respect. Purpose-driven action works differently. It is rooted in values, goals, and self-direction rather than immediate emotional stimuli. A man acting from purpose asks internally, what aligns with who I am? Instead of, what will keep this connection right now? This shift is subtle but powerful. It restores internal authority. Decisions are made calmly, not urgently. Responses are measured, not reactive. Psychologically, reactivity creates predictability. When a man reacts consistently to certain triggers, patterns form. Those patterns make it easier for the other person to unconsciously steer the dynamic. Again, this is not always intentional. Human beings respond to feedback loops. If certain behaviors produce predictable reactions, influence emerges naturally. Purpose-driven men disrupt these loops by remaining steady regardless of external fluctuations. Reactive men often believe they are being attentive or caring. In reality, they are being controlled by circumstance. Purpose-driven men can still be attentive, but their care does not cost them their center. They listen without losing themselves. They respond without abandoning direction. This creates a sense of grounded presence that is deeply stabilizing, and stabilizing energy holds influence. Another cost of reactivity is emotional exhaustion. Constantly adjusting behavior to manage outcomes drains mental and emotional resources. Over time, this leads to resentment, confusion, or emotional withdrawal. Purpose-driven action conserves energy because it is consistent. When your behavior aligns with your values, you don't have to constantly recalibrate who you are depending on the situation. Purpose-driven men are not rigid. They are adaptable, but their adaptability is intentional. They can hear feedback, make adjustments, and still remain aligned with their direction. Reactivity bends under pressure. Purpose flexes without breaking. That difference is felt immediately in how a man carries himself and how others respond to him. In relationships, purpose-driven action also restores polarity. Attraction depends on differentiation, two grounded individuals choosing each other, not one orbiting the other. When a man acts from purpose, he remains distinct. He has his own rhythm, priorities, and momentum. This creates space for genuine connection rather than emotional entanglement. Importantly, shifting from reactivity to purpose requires awareness. It means pausing before responding. It means tolerating discomfort instead of rushing to resolve it. It means trusting that alignment matters more than immediate approval. These choices feel uncomfortable at first because they interrupt old patterns. But over time, they build emotional strength and self-trust. When a man stops reacting and starts leading himself, psychological dominance fades. The dynamic equalizes not through confrontation, but through stability. Influence returns naturally to the person who is centered, calm, and self-directed. And from that place, relationships stop being emotionally exhausting and start becoming intentional again. Inconsistency between words and actions is one of the fastest ways authority dissolves in dating and relationships. It doesn't require betrayal, arguments, or dramatic mistakes. It happens quietly through small gaps between what a man says and what he actually does. And those gaps, when repeated, reshape the psychological dynamic more than most people realize. Authority is not about dominance, it is about credibility. When a man's words align with his behavior, people trust him instinctively. When they don't, uncertainty enters the dynamic. A woman may not consciously analyze it, but she feels it. Promises that aren't kept, standards that change under pressure, and boundaries that disappear when challenged all send the same signal. His center is unstable. Many men unintentionally create this inconsistency because they want to be liked, understood, or conflict-free. They say what sounds right in the moment, then adjust their actions later to avoid tension or loss. At first, this feels harmless, but over time it trains the other person not to take his words seriously. When words lose weight, authority follows. Psychologically, consistency is what builds trust. Trust is not built through intensity or emotional declarations, but through predictability of character. When a man says he values something and then compromises it repeatedly, his internal structure weakens. The woman begins to sense that pressure or emotion can change him. Once that perception forms, influence shifts naturally. Inconsistent men often don't realize how much they are communicating. Saying, "I'm not okay with this," and then tolerating it anyway teaches others that discomfort will eventually be ignored. Saying, "I need space," and then returning immediately teaches that boundaries are flexible under emotion. Each time this happens, authority erodes a little more, not because she takes it, but because it's surrendered. This inconsistency also creates internal conflict. When actions don't match values, self-respect declines. A man may feel frustrated, confused, or resentful without fully understanding why. That internal friction shows up externally as indecision, passive behavior, or emotional volatility, and instability is felt long before it is discussed. Another cost of inconsistency is loss of polarity. Attraction depends on clarity. When a man's stance changes based on mood, fear, or approval, clarity disappears. The dynamic becomes unpredictable. The woman may feel unsettled or disengaged, not because she wants control, but because the ground keeps shifting. Stability creates attraction. Inconsistency dissolves it. Consistency does not mean rigidity. It means alignment. A consistent man can evolve, adjust, and learn, but his changes come from reflection, not pressure. When he changes direction, it's intentional, not reactive. This distinction matters. One signals growth, the other signals lack of center. Men who maintain alignment between words and actions communicate self-respect effortlessly. They don't need to explain themselves excessively or defend their choices. Their behavior does the talking. When they say no, it means no. When they commit, they follow through. This reliability creates psychological safety and restores balance. Importantly, consistency must exist even when it's uncomfortable. Authority is tested under pressure, not ease. Anyone can hold values when nothing is at stake, The moment of truth comes when maintaining alignment risks tension, disagreement, or loss. A man who remains consistent in those moments signals strength quietly without force. In relationships, this strength changes everything. Influence equalizes. Respect stabilizes. The dynamic becomes cleaner because expectations are clear. There is less confusion, less testing, less emotional turbulence. Not because the man controls the relationship, but because he controls himself. Inconsistency undermines authority, not through one mistake, but through patterns. And consistency restores it the same way through repeated alignment over time. When a man's words and actions speak the same language, psychological imbalance has no place to grow.